Welcome to our ISA Presents talk with Neil Landau about the bold new TV world that is upon us. We are giving away 3 copies of Neil's book, The Showrunner's Roadmap, Creating Great Television in an on-demand world. And what you need to do is you need to go on Twitter and I'm so bad at this.
Click here to get the book. It looks like Molly put it in.
There's the book. So go on if you want to win a free book, there's 2 things we're doing. One, you can win a free book by going on Twitter and tagging us and putting in there what you learned today, what your favorite part about this talk was, any sort of information that you want to share that you learned today, put that on Twitter. Also, if you would like to buy this book, which I absolutely highly recommend, I have read this and I was blown away by how it felt so freaking current. And it is current because Neil right here talked to and interviewed all the current showrunners that are working right now. It is super, super valuable. I highly, highly, highly recommend. I'm not just saying that. I really, really do.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. And there's just so much information in it. So thank you, Neil, for writing this book. Okay.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you. We are here with Neil Landau. So just a little introduction about Neil. Neil is an award-winning screenwriter, producer, and author, and currently an associate professor at Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication and founding director of screenwriting in the MFA Film and Television program at the University of Georgia. He serves as executive script consultant for Sony Pictures Television International for many years, and his movie credits include, which one of them is, come on, you guys, Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, that they're almost filming the reboot of right now.
Yes, the remake is going into production in July.
Awesome. If you guys have not seen that movie, where have you been? 1 and 2, watch it because it still holds up. We did a talk with Neil, what was it, like a year ago or 2 years ago?
I think it was 2 years ago, but it's hard. I don't even know what day it is anymore. So
I know.
Yeah.
And I watched it again before that, and I was laughing at things that I remembered and new things. It's wonderful. So again, Neil is the writer, and what we're sort of talking about today among current topics about television. But again, if you guys want to get this book, it is amazing. Go get it right now. Go on the link and buy a copy and get 20% off. Okay. So first off, let's start with, so this is the second version of this book. You updated it, added obviously current information. Why did you want to write this book?
I started my career writing movies, and actually started writing plays. I wanted to be a playwright, and I wrote my first play when I was in 4th grade. Don't worry, I'm not going to go back that far. But I was raised by a single mom. My father died when I was 6 years old. He was 39. He had a heart attack. I knew I wanted to write, and I lived in my imagination because I had a painful childhood. And a lot of it was just escaping into stories and little skits. And I was the kid who, put on a show with my friends and made all my relatives watch it. Then I thought I was going to become a playwright, but I did grow up, we struggled financially, and I just thought, if I could do this, but also make a living doing it, or have the opportunity to make a living, that would be my dream. So I decided to go to film school. I directed a couple of short films, which told me I did not want to be a director. But I really liked writing. And I found that with the plays, the good thing about the theater is when you're writing, you get immediate, either you're getting immediate gratification, or if you're bombing, but there's somebody there. So that was really helpful to just become a stronger writer just at a very young age, because I saw there's an audience and there's a relationship between, what's going on stage and how they're receiving it. But then, I started to just get more interested in film because I came of age when the first blockbusters, like Jaws and Raiders of the Lost Ark, were sort of movies that I saw over and over again initially. And then I got very excited about movies, but also because I was raised by a single mom who had a full-time job, I was a latchkey kid. So I would come home after school, I would walk home, I would come home, let myself at home, make myself a snack, do my homework, whatever, but I would watch television because it was so I tell people I was raised by television, more or less. And so I had a really strong interest in movies and television for a very, very long time. I went to UCLA screenwriting as an undergrad. And at the time, we only offered, when I say we, I was at UCLA for a long time as a teaching and co-director of MFA Screenwriting, writing for television, and that track. When I was a student, though, there were no screenwriting classes for writing for television. People were not writing pilots. It was the time where television was considered a much lesser art form, or not an art form at all. You know, well, when I grew up, television was called the idiot box.
Right.
And you know, we didn't see the types of shows that we started to see, you know, when starting with, like, you know, The Wire and Oz and Sopranos, you know, all that. So the first, I wrote movies, only movies. Then I got an opportunity to teach a introduction to screenwriting class at UCLA Extension. And I had to really start to think about what do I actually do, and how do my friends do it? And there isn't one way to do anything. But at the time, I had a syllabus and I taught screenwriting a certain way. And I had developed an exercise that were these 21 questions. It started as, I think, 6 questions, and then it grew to 10, and then 21. And then so just for years, people would say, you should write a book about this. You should write this exercise and do a whole book about it. So I wrote a book, basically. Well, the first book I did, I was a writer for hire. It's called 101 Things I Learned in Film School. And it became a huge global bestseller phenomenon in tons of languages. And then because of the success of that little book, I was contacted by this publisher, Focal Press, saying, do you want to write a book for us? And I said, well, not really, because I'm still hoping to be a working screenwriter, but they really wanted me to do it. And they said, why don't you just send us the syllabus, or send us that exercise, that handout, and that'll be your book proposal, and we'll make a deal with you to write this book. So the second book is called The Screenwriters Roadmap, but it was about writing movies. What I found when that book came out, as everybody knows now, the market is just glutted with books on how to writing screenplays. You know, Robert McKee, Sid Field, Save the Cat, you know, Blake Snyder, there's so many. So besides the fact that my book kind of got lost because there were just too many on the topic, the other thing was that I always felt that a single authored book on the topic was too narrow, because I felt like, well, one, if you knew everything, why are you writing this book and not writing the next, you know, great movie? But also I thought, I always said to myself, if I ever do one of these books, I want to have a lot of different perspectives, because I'm not at the top of a mountain, you know. So after that book, I'd already kind of been in the mode of research, interview, transcribe, learn, and then write. Because for those of you who don't know the book yet, like about half the book is me and my insights, and then the other half are insights of showrunners and people I interviewed. So when in 2013, my publisher came to me and said, you know, we have an overabundance of books on writing screenplays, but we don't really have any yet of writing for television. And at the time, nobody even knew what a showrunner was. Like, that wasn't even a term. And I remember I even had to debate with them a little bit about the word showrunner, because they said nobody's going to know what that is. And anyway, so then that book became very, very, very popular because it filled a void in the market. And I did the same format, which was each chapter was on a specific aspect of craft. And I interviewed each showrunner, and the interview would mostly be centered on the topic of the chapter. But I really liked that I never had an agenda. I just wanted them to tell me just what their creative process is and what the challenges are and what the benefits are. And what I did with the second book, and I did it with all these books now, because this is now the 6th book. I didn't write any of my text until after I did all the interviews. So the reason it's very current is because I'm learning. As I'm writing it, and I'm all that information I'm kind of weaving into things. So that was something that I was constantly learning. And one thing, just to kind of bracket this whole conversation we're having is the television business is continuing to change, and it's changing as I'm speaking. Like it just keeps changing. So writing about anything to do with media right now is like trying to photograph a bullet in motion,
right,
or a train that's moving. But I did, so in 2013, that book came out. That was the first edition of this book. It was very, very popular. And then suddenly one of my friends calls me the accidental expert, because suddenly I became an expert on the television landscape. And I remember, because these books take an enormous amount of time. I mean, it's years and hours and hours and hours, because in order to do, like I interviewed Shonda Rhimes, there was no way I was going to interview Shonda Rhimes without watching all of her shows and knowing them inside and out. So anyway, I remember after that book came out, it was very successful. And I was lying in bed one night thinking, I never want to do another one of these books, because it's a huge, huge project. It takes a long time. But I remember I had this just popped into my head, and it was TV outside the box. I thought television is changing radically the way the music business changed, from albums and, well, we had vinyl, we had 8-track, we had cassettes, we had, I thought TV is changing that way. It's not going to ever be the same. It's going to completely be different. And I thought TV outside the box, that's a good title. I got up at like 2 o'clock in the morning and I went to my computer and I thought, if that title doesn't exist, I have to write another book. Then I became a specialist in what I call the digital television revolution, which was just this huge change. And this book became an outgrowth of all of that research and all of those things. Because TV outside the box, I interviewed 65 people, and it wasn't just showrunners, it was execs, it was producers, it was, it was trailblazing. And so I wanted to find the first ones who were really doing this and breaking all the rules and doing, just reinventing and reimagining television. And then, of course, the first edition of TV outside of the TV Showrunners Roadmap, this book, totally outdated. I mean, everything's changed. And so that's when they came to me and said, do you want to do another edition? And here we are.
You were like, no, but I'm going to. So you interview just a ton of, every chapter is kind of like another person. I was like, wow. Who maybe was the most surprising, or somebody that you interviewed in this book that maybe surprised you, or wasn't what you expected, what they said, or their insight?
There's so many, but the one that actually comes to mind the most, and it was the second to last interview I did, because he's very busy, was Dan Levy, Schitt's Creek. Because Schitt's Creek, after it won every possible award imaginable, which was kind of a surprise for a lot of people, it took me a long time to get Dan. It turned out, this is a little piece of trivia that I found flattering and interesting, but I got to Dan Levy. I know his management company, but I thought there's no way he's going to do it, but it turns out that Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead is one of his favorite movies. He loves the movie. And so when she asked, he said, well, who is this guy? And then he started quoting lines of dialogue from it. And anyway, when I finally spoke to him, I was really impressed and actually just blown away by his humility. He's very humble. He's not arrogant at all. He's extremely, he overthinks everything. He's very neurotic. He doubts himself all the time. And I found it really comforting, because you would think that once somebody has won every award and just, has just ridden that wave of fame and success and accolades, that there might be something about him that, where maybe he was full of himself, or just not at all. He was so humble, so kind. And the other thing that interested me about it was, and Sam Levinson, I can talk about also, and in relation to Euphoria, but I said to Dan, like, so when you and your dad kind of came up with this, with Schitt's Creek, was it just a fish out of water comedy and the culture clash? And he said, oh no, that's never what it was about to me. And I said, because I think if you've seen the show, you think that's what it's about. Right. He said for him, it was always a show about loss, and that he the comedy grew out of the loss, and the loss was the lives they had, the friends they had, and how they just had to readjust, and how they came together as a family. And so the heart, I remember early on with Schitt's Creek, it looked like it might be one joke, just like Ted Lasso started, and it seemed like it could be one joke, but it deepens. And so it went to really surprising places, but it really surprised me just how open and accessible and humble and no attitude. He directed, I think he co-directed the finale of the show, but he didn't, I asked why he hasn't directed very much and if he wants to direct more. And he said he doesn't think he knows enough yet, like he's not ready. And, you know, so that was really.
Always learning. Even you said it when you were like doing all of this, always learning.
Yeah.
I think that's something as a writer, we're always learning. You have to.
Yes. And the other little takeaway surprise was Sam Levinson, who adapted the Israeli, you know, Euphoria was based on an Israeli format, even though Sam Levinson completely reinvented it based on his own.
Yeah, I did not know that. I learned that in the book and I was like, whoa, I did not know that.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
I mean, well, what was so interesting is I said, so at the core to you, is this a high school show? And he said, no, it's not a high school show. I would never want it to be a high school show. And I said, why not? And he said, well, first of all, I never graduated from high school because he was in and out of rehab. And
wow.
And for him, the show is about addiction. And it was, it just happens to be people at that age. But it runs through adults, high school age, everybody. So anyway, that was, and I did find of all the shows I wrote about that there is a common denominator with almost all of them, that they are all about loss.
Right.
On a certain level.
When we talked earlier, while I was reading the book and we talked, you had mentioned that. So I was kind of thinking about that as I was reading and kind of thinking about what we were going to talk about. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit more about this theme that loss is a word that can be used in many different ways. So I think we're going to get to that later, but I wanted to just talk to you about sort of just an overview of your book. You talk about the way that the TV industry has shifted in the recent years and is still shifting and continually shifting and will continue to shift with streaming. And, just there's so many more television programs and series and limited series and long running series and sitcom, there's just a ton now. So what have you seen change the most in your process of writing this book? And that means like globally and also just within like the rules of storytelling.
Well, I kind of feel I observed kind of a pattern of like three main changes. I'm sure everybody else has observed it too, but it isn't just an observation. It's actually just real because I know it from the studio network side and the production company side, not just from the creative side. One is the entertainment business, especially television, has become completely global. So it's almost impossible to sell a show now that can't travel. Meaning one of two things, which also has shifted. It isn't just that they're going to sell the show and license it to another country and they're going to remake it, in the local language and the local setting. It's actually audiences will watch shows in their original language, in their original setting. So, and obviously Squid Game proves that was a huge, unprecedented number of people watching. So look and see, does your show have global appeal? Global appeal means relatable themes. And one of the things I observed in the first edition of the book, which still holds and helps make something global, is all long-running successful shows are about families and whether they're related by blood or not. So it could be a workplace family, it could be a biological family, it could be a family, like the way the sitcom Friends was pitched and the way they sold it was this what if, because all great ideas start with the same two words, what if something happened. The way they pitched Friends to the network was, what if your friends were your family? And that sounds very basic, but hugely successful. So global relatability, there's a paradox about what is relatable that I actually heard from Ryan Murphy, who has become very successful, whether you like his work or not, which I have a love-hate relationship with Ryan Murphy's work. But anyway, he says the more specific you make something, the more universal it becomes. So to make something global, I would say the idea is not to pander and try to make it really generic so it applies to everybody.
Right.
It's actually just going into as deeply as you can into that culture, into those relationships, into their challenges. They will be very relatable because we're human beings. And,
right.
You know, and so that's one. And because it's on demand and because streamers in particular are global, they're all over. That's also ushered in, which is everything's not being exported from Hollywood. You know, Netflix and HBO and Amazon and Apple, they're opening up offices all over the world to work with local producers, local writers, and to create content for their local market that they then hope can travel to other countries. So anyway, global, totally global business, has to be global. Number two, diversity, representation, and inclusion. I'm sure there are people, you know, on this call who are going, it's too much at this point that every show has, you know, it feels like it's responding to a mandate that you have to have, you know, representation from every culture and every race in every show. And I think that's the pendulum that's happened, which is a lot of it is, I won't talk about politics or religion, but we are polarized. So the industry is reflecting how polarized our tastes are.
Right.
And so, you know, if woke is a negative word, you're going to think it's way too much diversity, representation, and inclusion. If you are a marginalized person who was not represented and included as part of stories, it's still not anywhere near enough, and you're going to want more. And so we don't have to, just like in our world, we don't have to convince each other and change each other's minds about everything.
Right.
You can, it's available to you if you want to watch it, and it isn't if you don't. It's, when I grew up on television, there were 3 networks and you watched what was on when they told you.
Right.
So globalization, diversity, representation, and inclusion, just the reason I'm saying that is that if you're on this call and you have a show with an all-white cast, it's a very tough thing to, you know, that's not representing what people want right now.
Right.
In terms of the buyers in most of the world. So representation also includes LGBTQ. It includes representation of women, of course. And it's not monolithic. So I think that some people can, can be a challenge, but I view it as an opportunity. I've had students where I might say, have you thought about adding people with disabilities, people of color, people who are not just, you know, your standard stock white characters who have dominated television for so long? And they'll say, and I've heard this before, and I think it's interesting, and this is just my perspective on it. It isn't as simple as, I've had writers say, well, I'm not saying what race, color, ethnicity anybody is. I'm just writing it, and they can cast anybody they want, you know, which sometimes is called colorblind casting. If you watch Bridgerton, you'll see that they found a way for it to be somewhat historically accurate, or there's a theory that it could have been, to make it colorblind. If you watch The Great, it's absolutely just, Tony McNamara just wanted everybody to be every possible color because that's how he sees the world. It's not trying to be realistic. So anyway, the point is, if you're the kind of writer who is saying, I'm not going to specify people, they can cast anybody they want, that is a way to look at it. But remember, that could be discounting culture, race, and ethnicity. It isn't just skin color. And I think when people think it's too much, it's become ridiculous that every show is just, it's almost like they're ticking boxes. I think in some cases it's, they're not taking into account the lived experience of the culture, which enriches the story. So why wouldn't you want, it's not just a person's color, it's everything about their experience. So anyway, globalization in terms of just things available for everyone all over the world. Shows can travel even in other languages. Audiences will watch with subtitles if they're really good. Diversity, representation, inclusion, behind the camera, in front of the camera, all aspects. But it does start with the writer, because we're the blueprint and the roadmap. And then the high prevalence of IP, source material,
Right.
intellectual property. It's very difficult to sell an original show right now, which is extremely frustrating because we're creative people and we have imaginations. But if you look with, approaching 600 shows and the streaming wars, how do you market a show? And so the reliance on IP is just, it's a show with a built-in audience. Right. If it's based on a best-selling novel, the new trend, not even new anymore, it's now a few months old, is fictionalized versions of true crime shows, right, like Tiger King and The Staircase. And so those are the three things. And it's basically saying if we're making so much content and if it's available in so many places and for a price, which is one of the things that's changing, and on demand, you can watch it whenever you want. There still are shows that are doing very well that feature a predominantly white cast that have, different values. So it's something for everyone, but it doesn't have to be one show for everyone. So It's lots of variety for lots of different audiences. And those are on demand has changed everything because every show has a serialized component now, or most shows do. And the reason they do now, it used to be, it was much harder to sell a show that meant you had to see every episode to follow it. And the reason is if you missed a few episodes, you couldn't find out what happened until the summer when they put on the reruns.
Right, that's true. I remember those days. Those days.
But you're much younger. But yes, so now nobody ever misses an episode if they don't want to. And then the only difference becomes, it is very much based on classism. And there are people who, if you can afford a lot of monthly subscriptions and subscribe to all the streamers, you have more access than people who don't. And there will be a price point with commercials, even on Netflix. So we're just seeing sort of lots of adjustments, and it always seems like it's a business. So of course it's all money and profit driven. And yet at the core, there seems to be an attempt at equity and an attempt at, making shows that do reflect people's lives all over the world, as opposed to just a certain strata.
Right. So when we're talking about, what I want to do is talk about, I don't want to be discouraging to people who are listening right now, who are who are aspiring or on the path or are thinking about being a TV writer. So from your perspective, what is the best, and we can include in this sort of the hierarchy of how you become that showrunner who ultimately is the one who is creating shows or getting the opportunity to pitch their own ideas, original ideas, or have the clout to get IP. What is the path of somebody who is sitting down, writing a TV pilot or has written a TV pilot and says, this has never been seen before. This is a new world that hasn't been explored. And I want to make this show. Do you think that's feasible? Do you think that it's a possibility? And then what is the path for somebody who is interested or is trying to get to that showrunner level?
Well, there isn't just one path, but in terms of writing a pilot, there are two strategies. And one is it's a writing sample, and you're writing it to showcase your strength and your voice and how you'd be valuable in a writer's room. So one path is you're writing a pilot to get staffed on somebody else's show. And then you would start as a staff writer and you work your way up. So there's a hierarchy. Showrunners are always executive producers. They're almost always the head writer. Sometimes they created the show, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they come on to help shepherd something. So anyway, so writing a pilot to get staffed is different than writing a pilot that you might want to sell.
Okay.
It's a different approach because the pilot that you're writing to get staffed is showcasing, let's say you're a comedy writer. You're going to want to make sure that that script has a lot of jokes, that it's really showcasing if you're really edgy, what's unique about you, about your voice. And you would lean into that. If you are writing a show to sell, you have to then think, will it sustain beyond the pilot? You know, even if it's a limited series, how does it sustain beyond episode 1? And so you would have to write a pilot. Nobody cares how long it took you to write that pilot because you're not, you know, if before you break in, you're not writing it on a deadline. When I wrote TV Outside the Box, I discovered that pretty much all the buyers, this was several years ago, were at a lot of places. Hulu was one of them, and Netflix was another, that they wouldn't just buy a pilot. They wanted proof of concept beyond the pilot. At Hulu, that could mean they wanted more than one episode, maybe 2. And everybody now wants one of 3 things to supplement a pilot. They're never going to look at any of these things unless they like the writing and the idea. So you have to have talent and you have to get in the door, and we can talk about how to get past some of the gatekeepers, but they want to know, they're going to want one of 3 documents, either a pitch document, which basically says, after this pilot, this is where I'm forecasting the show will go. Most of the time, all they really care about is season 1, because, you know, that's plenty to get the show up and running. It will change once a room is formed anyway, if the show ever went. What they're talking about, though, is not so much explaining plot. It's the journeys of the characters. Where are they going from pilot to end of season 1? Where are they going to land? And what are they capable of at the end of the season that they were not capable of at the beginning of the season? How do the relationships change? How do they change? Things like that. So a pitch document would just explain that in words. A pitch deck would explain it in words with images. So if you had world building, if you wanted to just showcase and highlight the setting, if there was a historical context for it, so you'd words and images. There's a really good one that everybody can find online now. It's one of my favorite pitch decks is for Montauk, which was the original title of Stranger Things. It's a really good one. And then there are series Bibles where they'll say, we really like the pilot. Is there a Bible? And what they basically mean is, have you worked out where it's going? And can we have more detail, more information? We want proof of concept. Netflix, I interviewed Ted Sarandos for TV Outside the Box, and he said that they don't develop very much. They would never buy something that was half baked. So they want packages. So they want a script. They want a pitch doc, a pitch deck, or a series Bible. If you can come in the door with a producer with a proven track record, or a producer who has a deal with Netflix or HBO, or obviously they're going to be more predisposed to wanting it to work.
Right.
Sometimes it's attaching cast. If you have a relationship, particularly with an actor who, like Kaylee Kuko from Flight Attendant, she has a big overall deal at Warner Brothers Television. So, you know, getting her attached and going in through her deal, that makes a difference. That can help. So other ways in terms of proof of concept would be to make a sizzle, to make a presentation. The show Unreal that was on Netflix. I'm sorry, it was on Lifetime. Yeah. Now it's on Netflix, I think. Sarah Gertrude Shapiro had made a short that was based on her experiences as a producer on The Bachelor. And so that became something that became a little bit of, I always use like, I don't fish, but I eat it. But it's like baiting a fish hook and you're sending out the line. And the way, Hulu, yes. Unreal.
Thank you, Tristan.
Yes. So, you're just sort of seeing, do you get a bite? Do you get any traction? Is there interest? And sometimes you have to wait a while to have critical mass in terms of enough of a package to say, all right, it's like, now I'm mixing metaphors, but it's like, do I have a strong poker hand? I know I have the pilot. Everybody thinks it's really strong. It's been through at least 10 drafts. Everybody thinks it's strong. I have a really strong pitch deck. I have a project that I attached a director to, who's an executive producer director, because he would guarantee the look and the style of the show. Also, sometimes a lot of it is, how is it going to translate from your vision on the page into a visual representation of the show? So pitch decks can be helpful for that, because it evokes the look and the tone of what you're going for. Tone is very, very, very important in terms of television. It's probably the most important thing about TV, because it's a subgenre within genre, and there's so many shows. So one way is you get staffed. Hopefully it goes well. You're in a writer's room. You pitch your little heart out. You write really strong first drafts. That's the way to stay employed in television. And then you get promoted, hopefully. Mm-hmm. So you go from, staff writer to story editor to executive story editor, co-producer, producer, consulting producer, supervising producer, co-EP, and then executive producer. Right. All showrunners are executive producers, but not all executive producers are showrunners. They're just upper level writer producers who write, but also have producerial duties. And if you can get on staff on a show that either is a hit and just stay there, you'll ascend. And you'd like Gordon Smith is someone who was on Breaking Bad as a PA, who's now an executive producer on Better Call Saul. But he was on Breaking Bad for its entire run. He's been on Better Call Saul its entire run. He's an amazing writer. So anyway, that's the path of staffing. And then once the longer you're on staff, the more you're going to interact with execs, the more you're going to have a track record, you're going to be dependable. The other would be you come up with something that's so uniquely you that nobody's quite done before in the way that you would do it. So before I answer that, this is hopefully a good takeaway for everybody. I always tell my students, and I ask this to myself, before you sit down to create a show or to write anything, I always say, ask these 3 questions before you engage. 1, why this idea? Like, what about this idea attracts you? Why you as the storyteller? So right. Why could you do this better than anybody else based on your background, experience, insight, perspective? And then why now? Why is now a good time for it? And if you have compelling answers to those 3 questions, it will really help you in your pitch, because it's timely and it just feels like it's ripe to do a show around it. So the other route would be, and I'll give you an example. This is not a name dropping example, and you might not even like the show, but it's just a true story. I was teaching an MFA workshop at UCLA years ago, and I had a student who pitched a few ideas, and one of them was about drag ball culture in New York in the 80s. And the student was Stephen Canals, who created the show Pose. And he wrote it in my class, the first draft. At the time, it was the idea he was least enthusiastic about writing. And he was going to, and not for the reason you'd think. So Stephen Canals is a fanboy, and he loves aliens, and he basically loves superheroes. He loves the MCU. That's all of his stuff. But I did ask him, can I just ask you a question? You don't have to answer it if it makes you uncomfortable, but where are you in any of these stories? It's like they seem so disconnected from you. Right. I'm just wondering if there's a more personal story that you might be interested in writing. And he said, you're really freaking me out right now, Neil. And I said, why? And he said, well, because of course there is. And I said, well, would you feel comfortable pitching that to the group? And he said, okay, I'll pitch it, but I don't want to write it. And I said, why not? And he said, because nobody will ever buy it and no one will ever make it. And I just think that's an inspirational story, because, that changed his life by writing that pilot. So I do really encourage people, no matter what genre you're writing in, even if, the show was, it says, and it was, it was Pose on FX. I thought I said it. Anyway,
you did at the beginning.
So, yes, Pose. I would always look for what makes it personal to you on a certain level. It doesn't have to be autobiographical.
Right.
I'm just talking about something that you just know better than anybody else, and you can get to that texture and the specificity and the layers. Somebody put in the Reservation Dogs, one of my favorite shows. Love it. Love the specificity. Love the relationships between the characters. We haven't had shows about Indigenous people that with such humor and such grace and magic realism. Anything that Taika Waititi does, I tend to really like.
Me
because
too.
he's provocative, but he also he goes there. So
Yeah.
bold storytelling is also really good. So there's a question about Jenny Livingston's, oh my God, Paris is Burning. Took me a second. So what happened was Stephen, when he pitched it, it was going to be a series. Of course, it was inspired by the doc Paris is Burning. What happened was Ryan Murphy was in the process of buying the rights. There's IP again for Paris is Burning. And he heard there was a pilot that was already in existence out in the market on the same topic. So Ryan said, well, maybe I should just read that because it's already written. And he knew it was written by a biracial gay man, and he liked that. He wanted to support that. So anyway, he read it. He really liked it. He called Stephen in for a meeting, and the rest is history.
It's amazing. I mean, one thing I wanted to touch on that you were talking about is that Stephen did not want to write that. And I think that sometimes as writers, we have to look inward and say, okay, there's a thing that I know and I'm scared, or whatever reason it is that I don't want to write this. And that's probably why you should write it, because you should let all of that out, and you should write to those painful moments and all of those emotions that you have. I mean, that's the gold right there. So if you have this weird feeling of like, no, I'm not writing that, that's probably the thing you should write.
Yeah, Terrence McNally, the late, Tony Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, has a great quote, which is, tell the story you're most afraid to tell, which, could be a comedy. It could be,
Sure.
It doesn't have to be super serious, heavy-handed, messagey or anything. It's just, look at authenticity as something that is something all of you bring to every script you write. It's your authentic, your lived experience. What does it mean to be authentic in telling a story to you? And put that on the page.
Right.
People respond to it.
Yes. So speaking of that, chapter 5 in your book is called The Power of Empathy. And I love this because I think that we throw around the word empathy a lot in the world. So from your viewpoint, and I believe that in this chapter, you interviewed Jesse Armstrong. Is that correct?
Yes, about Succession.
So can you just talk about the power of empathy and how to use that in writing, and maybe something you learned from Jesse?
That's a great question. They're all great questions. Well, one thing is I deliberately wanted to challenge myself. So I picked, for The Power of Empathy, I thought I'm going to pick a show where you really don't care about anybody.
Right.
Don't
You're
empathize.
like, I'm not rooting for them. I'm not rooting for any of them.
It's a bunch of entitled, privileged white billionaires. They're aggressively alienating, and yet somehow we're drawn in. And so I knew I wanted to interview him on that just because I knew it would be a challenge. I knew it'd be easy on a show where, like This Is Us, of course, empathy. Well, one thing for empathy is the distinction between empathy and sympathy. So sympathy is where you feel bad because something happened to somebody else and they have your compassion. Oh, that must be so painful. That's sympathy. Empathy is where you feel like you're walking in their shoes, like you're in their skin. What is it like to be that person? And sometimes along with empathy, I also like to use the word grounded, about tone. Grounded means, what if this really happened? And part of empathy is, what if this really happened? So I write a lot about in the Empathy chapter about WandaVision, which was a show that I really loved because I think it transcended the television medium in terms of what it explored, but talk about a show about loss and grief. And I felt that, you have somebody who's either trapped in a sitcom at various decades, or a superhero, or a witch, living this completely bizarre existence that none of us has lived, as far as I know. And yet we completely relate to her because she was in love with somebody who, more or less died. And so empathy to me is the key for every screenwriter, no matter what you're writing, TV, film, and playwright, every writer. It's all about empathy. And then, of course, the follow-up is always, well, how do I generate it? Where does it come from? And empathy to me comes from character vulnerability. So when the characters I like to use a really bold modifier even, which is when characters are excruciatingly vulnerable is when we connect with them the most. And the reason for that, I believe, is that when we're vulnerable, we feel we need to create defense mechanisms, and we need to either have an armor or a persona, or in some cases we numb with drugs and alcohol, just because it's so painful to just be yourself. And we're so afraid of, if people knew the real us, they might reject us, they might abandon us. And so two components to empathy that I think play into storytelling. One is the role of shame, which is, notice how just when somebody's vulnerable, like if you're vulnerable and you cry, almost the first thing anybody does when they cry is they hide and they apologize. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And we feel really bad about ourselves and we feel ashamed. So the other thing that I find in all the shows and in real life is the key to empathy, besides vulnerability, is the most difficult thing that any human being will ever be called on to do, whether they're fictional or real people, which is forgiveness. To forgive is something we're all capable of doing, and yet it's so challenging. And the most difficult people to forgive are our personal challenges. And then, of course, forgiving ourselves for mistakes and things we do, because nobody's perfect. That's also relatable. So if you're not accessing your character's fears, how they're vulnerable, their coping behaviors to avoid feeling vulnerable, you're not going deep enough into your work. And even with comedy, you need to go deep. Yeah. So when I said, at least 10 drafts for a really like an A+++ pilot that's going to do something for your career, people have to feel something. You have to move them. They have to laugh. They have to cry. They have to be afraid. And that's empathy. It's like you feel you're in there with them. When they're afraid, you're afraid. Their problems become our problems. I'll give you one other quick analogy that I find is really helpful. Hopefully a good takeaway for those listening and watching. Movies are a finite experience. So the difference between a movie and a television series is a movie is designed to have a beginning, middle, and an end. The climax, the end, unless it's Lord of the Rings or designed to be a franchise. Right. Television pilot is designed to have a beginning, middle, and an open end. And so you want to end your pilot with more questions than answers. And part of your pitch when you go to sell a show is, so at the end of the pilot, we're left with all of these questions that will be explored and answered by the end of the season or in later seasons. As long as there are more questions and things to discover, people are going to keep watching. So one of my friends had this great analogy, which is movies are designed to be a communal experience. They used to be in movie theaters, really, literally communal, but movies were designed to watch in one sitting and just have a full experience. A television series, because they're serialized and on demand, is more like a second life. And you can tap into it whenever you want. And there's cliffhangers, we worry about them, we talk about them, we judge them, we align with them, and we get really involved. So when I was talking about how polarized the whole world is in politics, what people watch is also part of identity politics and how we're polarized. So there are people who watch certain shows and there's people who don't watch certain shows, and it says something about them as well. And it's because they're really invested in these characters and who they are and what they stand for. So that's another thing that's really, to sell a show, you have to create something where they fall in love with your characters. Even if they're horrible people, there's something that makes them irresistible and you just want to keep discovering more. So with Succession, for me, if you take out Kendall, Jeremy Strong's character, I don't think the show would work. I think he's the soft center in that he's extremely flawed, but he has a conscience and he's the most vulnerable and he struggles the most. So yeah, that's what I talked to Jesse Armstrong about it. But with Succession, which is one of the rare shows that's such a huge phenomenon that's not based on IP, it's an original. The main thing I learned from him is that they don't care. They're not trying to generate empathy. It's a satire and they're just telling the story. They're going for what if these people really existed? And little by little, you start to realize that I wrote a little piece in the book to try to make sense of why you should empathize with anybody on Succession. And I called it Lifestyles of the Rich and Damaged. Because they're all of them are damaged. And once you really study Succession, which I'm sure this is probably really obvious, you don't have to even study it. The opening credit sequence speaks volumes about why we should care about them. You see them as children. You see how cold and aloof and standoffish their father is. You don't see a mother in the picture. They're never smiling. Their father's always walking out of frame or he's blurry. The kids are all very stiff. And for me, that sequence breaks my heart and makes me care about them. Even when they do horrible things, that makes me hate them. Yeah. And I'm toggling back and forth. And yet I watch it all the time. So
I do too. And I feel like for me, it's the family dynamic, because I think that, there's people with huge families and there's people with small families, but I think that when you look at each character and where they are within the family, there's the only girl in the family. There's, the younger one. There's the brother who has a different mother, correct? Or is it?
Yes,
different mother. So there's this really interesting family dynamic and sort of where everybody's place is, or where they felt like their place was versus where they want their place to be. So that to me is like the really interesting part about Succession. It's not so much the big money. The spectacle of it is fun, but for me, I really tune into like these weird family placements and kind of where they're trying to get. And it is about money, but it's about respect within your family and like where you are. And like, it's so layered. I love Succession, but yes, I hate
also
them at the same time.
No, I was just going to say also though that, it reinforces a narrative that I think a lot of people, that appeals to most people, which is money doesn't buy you happiness.
Yep. Yeah.
So you can vicariously look at all these beautiful places they live and the clothes and the private jets, but they're miserable. And we get to feel a little superior to them, just like in true crime shows, because most of the true crime shows are about really privileged people who exploit people. And, so greed, I think it is cathartic for people to look at, because there's so much wealth inequality that when you see people that rich and powerful and how horrible they are, somehow there's something, Schadenfreude, the German word, which is, it's kind of fun to see them suffer and struggle despite having everything. And it's just great writing. It's funny, it's edgy, and it's not for everyone. So anyway,
that's true.
There's some things in the chat box I realized too, but
okay.
I don't see them.
I'm going to get to the Q&A. So again, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A right now, because I'm about to jump to that. But you teased earlier that you could give some ideas about how to get through the gatekeepers in terms of, so I know that one of the hugest questions we always get is like, how do I get myself out there? How do I get someone to look at my work? How? So you teased it. I'm going to take advantage of that. Tell us.
Yeah. Well, I have strong opinions about this. So this is just my perspective. And I wouldn't spend, if you don't have any experience and you have not written many pilots at all, and you don't have any traction, like if you're kind of starting out relatively new, I would not waste any time trying to get an agent at all. When the time is right and you have at least one extremely strong piece of material as either a writing sample or as something you think could potentially sell, I would target a manager, a literary manager. Most management companies manage writers, directors, actors, and also do production. They have a production arm. Managers, I have found, will take on new talent because they're always looking for the next, they're trying to discover the next hot, new, imaginative, visionary person. So managers tend to have more time for that. They'll read, they'll look, they'll want to read other things you've written. They'll give you advice, they'll give you guidance. So that can be helpful. There's a bunch of asterisks to this, but there are diversity programs and fellowship programs. The asterisks are, it can be a great way to get your first job. It's a great way to network. But there are people I know who don't like entering a writer's room or their first TV job through a diversity program, because for some, they feel it's a stigma and that they're the diversity hire or they're the diversity person, and that they wouldn't be there unless they came through that program. The diversity programs, just so you know what they were designed for originally, is the studios and networks realized they had a major diversity problem in terms of representation and everything being whitewashed for the most part. And so they started programs where they were able to offer education to people who are interested in being TV writers. And the door is mainly open to marginalized writers who weren't getting those opportunities. If you do well in one of those programs, they'll staff you on one of their shows. It doesn't come out of the show's budget. It's paid for by the network or the studio's budget. And so basically the writer's room is getting an extra writer, but it's not coming out of their budget. So they're incentivized. After that initial period though, the writer then has to, it's all just based on, are you good? Are your drafts good? Are you contributing to the room? So it's a way in. It's not the way in for everybody, but that is a way in. The blacklist is a great way in for features, but there are other forms of contests and other lists that you can get on. If you can win one of those contests, whether it's at Austin or the best one for television is the Sundance Episodic Lab. It's the most prestigious one. So any of those are really helpful. Even if you're a quarterfinalist or a semifinalist, it helps. The thing about some of these programs that can provide opportunities and get you in the door, a lot of people apply once, and if they don't get in, they just say, well, forget it. Almost all of them, you have a better chance of getting in the more times you apply.
Yeah.
But the caveat is you have to apply with a new piece of material each time. So you can't just keep taking the same script and hoping it's going to get you there. Another way in is to network with others, and whoever makes it up or through the gate first, hopefully lends a helping hand to bring other people in. One of my former students from UCLA, her name is Francesca Sloan. She's had an incredible career. Her last two credits were on Atlanta and Fargo, the series. She's now the showrunner adapter of the movie Mr. and Mrs. Smith. They're turning it into a series for Amazon. Francesca did the pilot. She's running the show. It's Donald Glover, and it was going to be Phoebe Waller-Bridge in the Angelina Jolie role, but it's now Maya Erskine from Pen 15. Anyway, yes. So why did I bring up Francesca?
Because you're saying about bringing other people. Like
yes, thank you.
Yes.
See, it happened to me. I know. So we can help each other. When Francesca got the show greenlit, she hired 2 UCLA students who were in her cohort.
Right.
And so they got opportunities.
That's great.
So
and everyone should do that, whether
Yes.
you're the person who makes it or you're friends with, that's how it should be. That's great.
Yes. So so that a lot of it is, you might think, I don't know anybody. How am I going to get through the gate? everybody's on the outside of the gate. Somebody will make it through the gate. And that person will be like, hey, there's an opportunity, or I heard about something, or almost another thing, which isn't necessarily the key to opening up the gate, but I have dozens and dozens of my former students from UCLA in particular are now really successful TV writer producers and showrunners, many of them. There's a long list. It's pretty amazing. I'm extremely talented people who are sustaining really successful careers. One of the things almost all of them had in common was they were in writers groups. And even after they graduated, they kept meeting in the writers groups. And one by one of this writers groups, every single person in that writers group is now either running a show or like every single person. So
wow.
I know so many writers who just kept that going, and you just are really hard on each other, but nurturing and supportive and yet honest. And you help each other get through the gate by being ready, because the truth about the gate is that they need you to come through the gate. They need writers, they need content. It's just, there's so much. So they would need curation, they need recommendations, they need ways to find out about somebody who's really good. And some of that is just through your network of friends and contacts. And, people help each other. I am not related to Martin Landau. I did not know anybody in the business. And, people break through every day. So I think those are the main things.
You have to be persistent. You have to keep going, and you have to hone your craft and have once you get that opportunity, you have to have a really good, really, really, really good product.
It has to be so strong, because it's the kind of thing where I have a feature now that I wrote 11 years ago that looks like it's finally going to get made. It's live action. Everybody who reads it now just goes, great script. Wow, that's the best thing you've ever written. I'm not saying that it is, but I'm just saying you'll know when you have a really good script, because people will go, wow, this is next level. So
okay, so let's get to some of these questions because they're good. David Clive, thank you for your question. Those questions that you brought up earlier, are the questions the primary component of story engine? Can you speak about engine a bit and how it relates to everything that you touched on so far? This is a great question. There's a chapter in Neil's book, chapter 4, all about story engine. So let's talk about that.
Wow, you're hired. Thank you. There are two kinds of story engines in general. One is what we've known from television for decades, which were case of the week. It's not a coincidence that most shows in the past, this is shifting a bit, but it's still here. Dick Wolf still dominates the airwaves, are about doctors, lawyers, and law enforcement. And the reason is that you have an unlimited number of stories. So story engines are what's going to drive the story forward. There's often now that shows are serialized, there's an overarching story that will cover the whole season. And then within each episode, there are micro missions or things they have to do toward that larger goal. Another way television has changed in terms of story engines is it used to be like Law and Order, which is still super popular. Every episode was based on formula. And every episode started with a murder. Then there was an investigation. Then there was a trial that was, a legal defense and prosecution planned, a trial and a verdict.
Right.
And that was in a 1 hour, which wasn't even 1 hour, that was 42 minutes. Now we see more slow burn. Bong bong. Yes. So anyway, yes, very iconic, all of those things. So on a procedural, story engines are very obvious. You've got a medical case, which is a medical mystery. You have to solve it. Old school television, which still exists today, was you'd get the answer by the end of the episode. You didn't have to keep watching to find out. So some story engines are just very procedural and they have stuff to do and they have to accomplish it. It's usually involves a mystery that has to be solved. And that could be a medical mystery, a whodunit, or a legal situation where you're trying to find the truth. Shows that aren't procedurals though, which are all the others, it's all about the relationship dynamics. So it's about people with problems, and the story engines are their problems. How do they solve their problems? And often there'll be one major problem that they're facing, and then they'll chip away at it each week. So Some writers' rooms will break story, breaking it down as A, B, and C stories. And the A story would be the main character and that character's journey or mission for the episode. There are ensembles where you have lots of different stories that are happening, all coexisting in the same episode. Sometimes those stories are all joined by theme, so it feels more cohesive. Sometimes they're not. Most writers' rooms still break story using A, B, and C stories and then weaving them together. But Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould, like Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, they don't break story A, B, C story. They just break story according to what's Walt doing this week? What's Skylar doing? What's Jimmy doing? What's Kim doing? It's whatever the show. And it's just, what's the challenge they have to face? But there's shows like that, there's usually an umbrella of all the stories. And I'm not talking Umbrella Academy. I'm talking an umbrella of like Euphoria. What's Rue doing in every episode? Well, up until now, she's trying to get high. She's just looking for drugs.
Sure.
If you watch the Nurse Jackie pilot, what's Jackie doing the entire pilot? She's looking for drugs. So sometimes it's just, and if you take somebody like Rue Bennett in Euphoria, she wants to get high. Who's the antagonist? Her mother, or anybody who wants to stop her from getting high. You know, so a lot of people also sometimes think of story engines in a limited way, because not all villains are antagonists, but not all antagonists are villains.
Right.
An antagonist can be a very righteous, loving person, but if they're disrupting what you want, they're an antagonistic force. So story engines are also fueled between characters trying to get something and with the potential to lose something, and it generates tension. And that's like an engine. It generates heat. The heat generated it comes from plot on the external level, but the heat is how the characters are emotionally reacting to these extraordinary situations. And you're always looking to mine the emotional truth of your characters. If you ever feel like you're getting away from, I talked to, one of the interviews is Issa Rae about Insecure. And I had also talked to Amy Aniobi, who was one of the EPs on Insecure. And somebody asked the question, as a white person, can I write Black characters? Or is that just something I shouldn't do? And Amy Aniobi's thing was, well, if you're a white person and you're writing about an entirely Black cast, she said, I probably would question, like, why are you telling this story? Maybe somebody else could tell it better, but she also said, if you are writing outside of your experience, which we all do, you know, you have to. I mean, that's, you know, unless you're just, everybody's going to be the same. She says, just go for the emotional truth. What are they feeling? Because that's more universal than specifically trying to, you know, act like, you know.
Right.
And also, you know, people sometimes step into the trap where they say, well, I'll research and just ask a Black person what this would feel like. A lot of that research these days is much more, I've had very good Black friends say, you know, it's not our job to teach white people how to write our characters. Why don't we get the opportunities to write our characters? And I'll say, that's a very good point. You know? Yeah. So anyway, I think I answered the question, but.
Yes, you did. I love that example though, of like the heat, I love that, because that correlates with engine, and it, you know, we're all like visual people where we're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I like it.
And I know how I got on the Issa Insecure Amy Aniobi tangent. I'm sorry, but it's an I think it can be a helpful point, which is well, one, it's, you know, anytime you're writing outside of your experience, it's there's a difference between just thinking that everybody you talk to is a monolith, you know, like, I want to talk to you because you're a Black female veteran. It's like, well, we're not a monolith. I had my personal experience, but there's so many other types of experiences. So you want to just go for honoring the character, because once we become attached to characters, we really care about them. And so a lot of times there's a lot of viewer backlash when characters behave in ways that we just don't think they would. And that's when it starts to feel like, you know, it's not authentic, you know, and that, and I think authenticity is just a huge, you know, it's a huge part of what everybody's, what everybody wants. So, and what I love about it is you cannot manufacture authenticity. So it's either authentic or it's not. And, you know, so story engines and all conflict or dramatic tension, whatever you want to call it, is fueled by the idea of control. So I view comedy as the escalation of chaos and to the point where it becomes comedic. Emotions are universal. So most dramas and dramedies are about control, the loss of control and trying to regain control. And dramatic tension generally comes from the three things that we cannot control. One, our emotions. Two, the environment, weather, we're seeing that now. Technology, a lot of stuff that's running amok and we're losing control of. And third, other people. So when you're looking at story engines, you're going, well, what is my character trying to do? What it really means, what are they trying to regain control over? And what's in the way? And what's in the way are the things they can't control. The atmosphere, other people, and their emotions. So never send out an email or make a phone call when you're coming from pure emotion, because you are not in control and you're probably going to regret it the next day. And yet we love watching characters on our shows who make impulsive, self-destructive emotional decisions that are just based on emotion, because it creates more conflict and more drama, and it's fun to watch. And it's funny and it makes us cringe. And we're like, oh no, oh no.
Right.
And yet we can't stop
I would
watching.
never do that. And then we turn around.
So if you're thinking of story engines as only related to plot, it's half of it. It's less than half of it. It's really about emotion and control. And that's always the goal. So.
Excellent answer. I'm going to answer Ava's question in the chat, and then I'm going to get to a couple more, and then we're going to wrap up. But she was questioning when you said reapplying to fellowships with different material, and it's a very important answer to give everybody about reapplying, because we've talked about this in many different talks that we've done with different executives and also the people who run Warner Brothers program and stuff. They will remember you. Just because you didn't win doesn't mean your name isn't, like, if you keep sending in good material, they'll keep remembering you. Just because you may not be the cream at the top and winning that time, if you keep going and you're persevering, your name keeps coming up and they're like, oh yeah, remember that from last year or whatever. Just keep yourself, and that's in everything, like keep your name out there, keep yourself going, keep showing that you have growth and that you're getting better and better, and you will get noticed. So
it also shows that you're prolific. It shows sometimes people also resubmit a new piece of material, but it's different in like it's maybe a different genre. It shows a different side of you. I think sometimes also younger writers, not by age, but just more inexperienced novice writers, people who are still breaking in. I think that often people think that they know what their strength is and they keep writing that, but sometimes you might be surprised by trying a different genre that you never thought that you'd write, and you bring something different to it and it ends up being the thing that you didn't even ever think of yourself for. So I think that's another reason to resubmit more material and to keep writing. You might discover something about your talent that you didn't even know. Don't limit yourself. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to end with this one, and then we're going to final thoughts. Larry Gilmore is asking, and this is also a great question, Larry. What if I just have a great story, but I can't really say why I'm the one to tell it? For example, I have a modern take on the Arthurian legend, have had it for years, and I'm just engrossed by it. So,
well, there is an answer that some people might tell you, which is lie, make something up, but I don't believe in that. I would definitely, there probably is a reason that if you really soul search, you'll find it. I'll give you an example by outing myself right now, but the first pilot I ever sold was about the Witness Protection Program. And it was about US Marshals who kept, people in WITSEC, Witness Security, which is run by the Marshal Service. It kept them safe. And I researched it for like a year. And the common thing between all of them was that they never felt safe. They always felt like they had to look over their shoulder, even when they had a new name and a new identity and a new address.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time I wrote it because I thought it would be a fun show to write. That would be a way into a lot of interesting stories. And I thought I'd never seen it before. And I was thinking much more marketplace, to tell you the truth. It wasn't for like years later that I said, I don't know why I wrote that actually. And they said, of course you do. You were in the closet. You came of age during a time that you never felt safe. And you were always looking over your shoulder, and you were always worried, is somebody going to bully me, or is somebody going to make fun of me? And I thought, you're right. Wow. I didn't even know. Sometimes it's a subconscious desire. So I wouldn't, anyway, so I would go.
But I think that's what you just said is somebody else told you that. So maybe you couldn't recognize that. So maybe, Larry, go talk to some people who know about your obsession with King Arthur, and maybe they can help you find a correlation between why you love that and about you and yourself.
And how it makes you feel when you read it, and when you first discovered it, and there's nostalgic. The other very quick one is I told you my father died when I was 6 years old, when he was 39 years old. My whole life, I've always played individual sports, but not group sports. If anybody throws a football or a basketball or a baseball at me, I'm like, get it away from me. It's been a source of shame, because everything I talk about, I deal with. I didn't know why until I was about almost 40 years old. And I said, I just don't play ball. I don't like team sports with balls. And my friend Pam said to me, well, it's so obvious. Why? And I said, why? Tell me why. And she said, well, think about how your dad died. My father died playing basketball. He collapsed on a basketball court. He died in the ambulance. He never even made it to the hospital. Maybe that's why.
Yeah. But again, somebody else had to tell you that, right?
So obvious, didn't see it.
Yeah.
Didn't see it. So anyway.
Yeah. Excellent. Not excellent that happened, and not excellent that you don't like team sports. But yeah, it's very insightful.
I like watching them.
Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah, anyway.
I like playing them. I don't like watching them.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. Neil, I just want you to give your final thoughts, maybe a bit of advice, any last words of wisdom to our TV writers, screenwriters, filmmakers, everyone out there. And again, we're putting the book in the chat. If you want to get this book, it's so full of great information. Go get it. This isn't a webinar to sell a book. We're Neil, but I'm telling you that it is a really great resource to have, and it's also entertaining. So go get it.
Basically, the advice I'll give you. I'm seeing chats sort of just fly by, but I was at UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television. I'm an alum, and then I was teaching there for a long time. I got an opportunity to teach at the University of Georgia because it's the second or third largest production hub in the United States. And so it just seemed like a great opportunity. And I also just wanted to get out of my comfort zone because I'm living in the Deep South, and I never thought I would. And it's been a really interesting, humbling, illuminating experience. I'll tell you that people say, how do the students compare in Georgia to the UCLA students? And they're very talented also. They have great stories to tell. The common denominator with all of them that I would love to leave you with is there are no shortcuts. You have to put in the work. And the more you have to have a writer's discipline. If you don't sit down and write, you're not going to meet all these things we're talking about. You're never going to get to those places because you won't have the material. So a quote from a screenwriter friend that I love that I'll leave you with is, a writer is a person who makes an appointment with themselves to write and keeps it. So look at your schedule writing hours, schedule time, turn off social media. I had a student somewhat recently, I won't embarrass them, who said they're missing their deadlines because they're watching TikTok and they're addicted to it. And I said, get off TikTok, get off social, turn off your ringer, close the door and focus. It won't happen if you don't do that. And so you have to look at what distracts you, what keeps you from your writing. then the more you write, generally you do get better. It's practice. And so it's like going to the gym or anything, it's a muscle. So it never gets easier, but it does get less painful when you hit a wall or write yourself into a corner because you've been there before and you know you'll probably figure it out. But it's very hard work. And if you're willing to do it and be prolific and tenacious, you can, and you have talent, you can actually make a living doing it, because most people give up.
Mhm.
So be the one who doesn't. I
Yeah.
didn't give up. Everybody, I had nobody, the only person who ever supported this as a career was my mother. So I credit my mother for everything. She just said, you're talented, you need to do this. And writing is easier than not writing. When I don't write, I just get depressed and feel bad. So
Right.
make an appointment with yourself to write, keep it, then give yourself the reward, whether it's a glass of wine or just feeling good about yourself because you got your work done. And if you want to find me or follow up, Facebook or Instagram. And thank you so much for hosting me. And I wish you all
Thank you.
great luck, because it can really happen. It's not just a pipe dream. So just work hard and stay focused on your goal, and
keep going.
and then you'll be the next one who calls in to ISA. So thank you so much for being such a great host, and
Oh, no,
Molly
thank
and
you.